So this is chapter 15. This is the last chapter of our unit on the Civil War, and we are entering Reconstruction. Okay, so last chapter ended with the assassination of President Lincoln. He has now been replaced by his Vice President, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is from Tennessee. Lincoln added him to his 1864 ballot. Hopefully, his plan was that hopefully this would help kind of connect the country because you have a Southerner, technically a Southerner, in office as well. Johnson was not a Confederate, though. He just was someone from what we would consider part of the South, who remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. The period from 1865 to 1877 is what we consider Reconstruction. There's several periods within that. There's 3 different types of Reconstruction, and we'll get to that as we move through this chapter. So basically what Reconstruction is it's the national government's attempts to rebuild the South after the Civil War. If you remember, we just discussed pretty much the devastation that was left behind in the South. Sherman's march to the sea and how he had kind of burned and destroyed much of Georgia. And it's not just the state of Georgia, all over the South. Remember, this is where they were fighting the war, was in the South. So there's lots of destruction. And it's not just actual physical destruction. You know, there's governments to be rebuilt. The slaves are now freed, so we have to figure out what that's going to look like in Southern society. And so during this period of time, you're going to see the nature of the federal government and its relationship to the states change dramatically. It's going to set a lot of precedents that we still are following today. Okay, so Lincoln already, before his assassination, realized, the war was going to be coming to a close. And so he was already brainstorming plans for what it would look like when we were joined again together as a nation. So his plan is known as the 10% plan, and this is how he would kind of readmit the southern states, or the states that had been in rebellion, back into the Union. And so his plan was to appoint a military governor for each state until there came a time when 10% of the citizens who had voted in the 1860 election, which was the election that kind of set things off, set the Civil War into motion, those voters had pledged allegiance to the Union. So just 10%. Once that 10% had voted allegiance, then he would turn over control to the civilian government instead of the military government for that state. He also wished to grant Confederate leaders pardon. He didn't want to put Confederate leaders in prison or try them for, war crimes or anything like that, anything crazy like that. He wanted to pretty much, Lincoln's whole goal was to kind of welcome back like a lost brother, a brother that you'd had a fight with, and in forgiveness kind of, in kind of bring a family together, like a family reunion. He didn't want to treat the South harshly, like a conquered enemy. That wasn't his goal. Okay, well, we have the radical Republicans in Congress, and they oppose Lincoln, and they propose the Wade-Davis bill. So their proposal within the Wade-Davis bill is that a majority of voters, not 10%, a majority of the voters that voted in the 1860 election would need to sign an oath of allegiance to the Union. They would deny the right to vote, which is also known as suffrage, to former Confederate leaders. The abolition of slavery was a must. And the North wasn't going to take on any of the Confederate war debt. Lincoln vetoes this bill. And like I was saying before, he doesn't really view the South as a conquered enemy, but the radical Republicans will. They'll see the South as a conquered territory. Kind of that they still want to punish the South for the war. So Johnson's plan, because now remember Lincoln was assassinated, so he's no longer there to push through his 10% plan. Johnson's plan is a modification of Lincoln's plan. He still proposes that the states be readmitted with 10% of its voters taking the oath of allegiance, but he had a stricter policy on Southern leadership and pardon, so he wasn't willing to kind of pardon all Confederate leaders or allow all of them to vote or hold political offices. There was some specifications that needed to be met there. So he's kind of in between Wade Davis and the 10% plan on that. And he believed that the plan for Reconstruction needed to come from the president and not from Congress. So before Congress met in session, after he had moved into the position of president, he's trying to get a lot of things kind of pushed through and done before that happens so that he can be in control of Reconstruction. Sorry about the heading there and the body kind of getting crammed together. So within Washington, there's a lot of division over how we're going to go about Reconstruction. Congress, once they do meet together, refused to recognize the changes Johnson had made without them in session. Johnson is known for having quite the temper, and he allows his temper to get the best of him. He makes a lot of crazy speeches. He compares himself to Jesus, and he kind of alienates himself from the Northern public with these speeches. So they're not really supporting him, and neither is Congress. Congress really doesn't like Andrew Johnson. In 1866, the Republicans have 2/3 of the seats in both houses of Congress, and they pass over Johnson's veto of the Military Reconstruction Act. Also, the Tenure of Office Act is passed through, and that's the one we're going to focus on first. Military Reconstruction Act we'll get to later. The Tenure of Office Act forbid the president from getting rid of Congress members without consent from the Senate. So he could fire a Congress member without Senate approving it. And Johnson thought this was unconstitutional. Later on, the Supreme Court will also agree with him that this is an unconstitutional act. And so Johnson kind of tries to, test the waters, and he dismisses the Secretary of War, Stanton, kind of just trying Congress on this issue. And he didn't really like Stanton anyway. He thought he was a radical Republican spy. So he decides to dismiss him. Stanton will kind of barricade himself in the office, and Congress will use this as a reason to impeach Johnson. So the House of Representatives presented formal charges against Johnson in February of 1868, and he goes to Senate to be tried. Now, impeachment isn't removal. If you're impeached, that doesn't mean that you're removed from office, but it does mean that you're tried before the Senate, and if they vote, you can be removed from office. So Johnson actually fell one vote short from what was needed for removal from office, but he was impeached. The members of the Senate who refused to vote towards his removal from office pretty much recognized that the charges here were kind of silly. They were going to remove him from office just because he disagreed with Congress, and that would set a dangerous precedent going, further into the future with other presidents. So I think it's only 7 members of Senate didn't vote for his removal. Or I could be wrong. Hold on a second. Let me make sure before I give you that number. Okay, 7 Republicans, 7 Republicans didn't vote, and they kind of risked their careers because the Republican Party is really who's against Johnson, but actually 12 Democrats also didn't vote for his removal as well. So, okay, last part of this section, we go through the Reconstruction Amendments. That's what they're known by, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Aside from the Bill of Rights, these are probably the most important amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted blacks full citizenship. If you remember before when we talked about Dred Scott, slaves and freed blacks were not viewed as citizens of the United States, so this granted them that right. The federal government may not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. That's huge to think that wasn't a part of the Constitution. Here it is now in black and white. In the 14th Amendment, due process of law means they can't just take your stuff away from you or put you in prison or have you executed for no reason. You have to go to court. You have to be tried. There has to be due process. Okay. It prohibited all former Confederate leaders from holding office unless they were approved by 2/3 majority of the House and Senate. So that's kind of that. You see the resolution there between the Wade Davis and the 10% plan. It increased the power of the federal government, was the most important, influential of the Reconstruction Amendments because it made the federal government, gave them some more powers over the states. Going back before the Civil War, that struggle between federal power and state power is kind of not resolved, but you see it lean towards the federal government here officially. Then the 15th Amendment gave universal male suffrage, so all white, black males could vote. Remember, suffrage means right to vote. It doesn't mean like suffering. When we talk about women's suffrage, we're talking about women's right to vote. Okay, let's look at your SRQ. How did Lincoln's 10% plan differ from the radicals' Wade Davis concerning the number of white males taking the oath of allegiance? 10% meant 10% had to vote. And then the Wade Davis wanted a majority of white males to vote, or to sign the oath. Suffrage, right to vote. How did Johnson test the Tenure of Office Act? How did the radicals respond to his action? He dismissed the Secretary of War, Stanton, and they impeached Johnson because of that. Why did 7 Republican senators vote for his acquittal at his impeachment? Because they thought it was unconstitutional to remove the President of the United States for simply disagreeing with Congress. And like I said, that would have set a dangerous precedent for the future. What were the 3 important provisions of the 14th Amendment? Granted blacks full citizenship, applied to the state the Constitution's provision that the federal government could not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the 3rd, it prohibited former Confederate leaders from holding office unless they were approved by 2/3 of the House and Senate. Okay, your paragraph shrink words will be compromise, division, removal. Compromise, division, removal.